Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. The day-to-day rush of being in a newsroom can be exciting. You know, you're scrambling to respond to the news and get a piece written or a show on the air or whatever. It's a fast-paced environment where a lot of the time, without an ombudsman or a public editor, you don't really have time for self-reflection. That's a gift that often can only come with retirement. So today we've got two books from veteran journalists looking at the job and what it entails. In a bit, we'll hear from one of our own, an NPR producer who spent years traveling the world with his microphone. But first, Marty Baron spent years at the helm of the Washington Post. And at the end of last year, he spoke with NPR's Mary Louise Kelly about his memoir, Collision of Power, and his advice to journalists working in an election year. That's ahead.
This message comes from Apple Card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase. That's 3% on products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply.
We journalists lament that we have used the term uncharted waters so often in recent years to describe the state of American politics that the term has almost ceased to register. But what else can we call this? What words feel adequate to the challenge of reporting on what is shaping up to be yet another presidential election year of, yes, uncharted waters, covering a Republican frontrunner who may well spend more time in court than on the campaign trail in these coming months. So how do we cover this? What have we learned from covering the elections of 2016 and 2020? How can we do better? How do we earn back public trust? I'm going to put these questions to a man who ran the newsrooms of the Miami Herald and the Boston Globe, and then took over the Washington Post in 2013 and steered that newsroom through Donald Trump's presidency. Marty Baron wrote about it all in his recent memoir, Collision of Power. Marty Baron, welcome to All Things Considered.
Thanks for having me.
There's so much discussion these days, as you know, over whether democracy is on the line in next year's election. Do you believe it is?
Yes, I absolutely do believe it is. All you have to do is listen to what Donald Trump has been talking about, what he says he's going to do in another administration. He's the only politician I've heard actually talk about suspending the Constitution. He's talked about using the military to suppress entirely legitimate protests, using the Insurrection Act. He's talked about bringing treason charges against the then outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's talked about bringing treason charges against Comcast, the owner of NBC and MSNBC. He's talked explicitly about weaponizing the government against his political enemies. And of course, he continues to talk about crushing an independent press. So all of those, by nature, by definition, are authoritarian in nature.
So let's turn to our role as longstanding members of an independent press. If one believes, as I gather you do, that good journalism is an act of patriotism, what does that look like these days?
Well, I think we have to be clear about what a second Trump administration would look like. We also have to look at what a second Biden administration would look like and see what his plans are. But with regard to Trump, he's being very explicit about what he intends to do.
So we report on what he says he intends to do. That's step one.
Not just what he says, but talking to his team and the plans that they're making for the policies they intend to implement as soon as he moves into the White House, if that turns out to be the case.
So let me put to you a couple of the arguments which you anticipate and write about in your memoir. One is that we can do the greatest reporting in the world. Does it matter if people, including Trump voters, are not reading or listening to media outlets like the Washington Post or like NPR, if we're not reaching people?
Yeah, well, it's true. Media consumption is highly polarized. The real challenge is how do we reach a broader audience, as you say. I think there are a number of things that we can do. I don't think that it's the case that our work doesn't resonate at all. I think it does resonate with the independent thinkers out there. That may not be a huge portion of the population, but it's a significant portion of the population. But I think we need to cover the totality of American society. We need to reflect people's lives, their concerns. And then on the more highly charged topics, we need to lay out the evidence. We need to point, if we're talking about a court document, we need to show that court document. We need to annotate it so that people can see exactly where we got the information, point to a video, point to a data set, point to an audio, whatever it might be, make the assumption that people won't believe a word we say, and then say, okay, here's the evidence, in the same way that a trial lawyer would present the evidence before a jury in a court.
I guess everything you're telling me sounds utterly reasonable. It also sounds not worlds away from what you might have told me 10 or 20 years ago if I were asking you how to cover a presidential election. Is it enough these days to lay out the evidence, to report facts, if people don't believe them?
Well, as I said, I do think that there's a portion of the population that is open to evidence. I think we'll never reach the point where everybody is going to trust what we do, but we can certainly reach a majority of the population and have them trust us. And let's look at incremental improvement. And I think that's what we ought to be focusing on.
So I know you're out now. You're happily retired. If you were back at the helm of the Washington Post today, would you be telling editors, telling reporters to approach this next election in any way differently than 2020?
Well, I'm happy with what we did in 2020 in terms of how we covered the election, both in 2020 and 2016. And I would approach it very much in the same way, at least at the Post. I do think there's some things that the media in general could change. I certainly don't think that CNN and Fox News should do what they did in 2016, which was airing his rallies from beginning to end without any interruption, without acting as an intermediary whatsoever and letting him say whatever he wanted, many of them entirely falsehoods. And so that I don't think was helpful. And it was practically a campaign gift to Donald Trump. So that kind of media behavior, I don't think is appropriate and certainly should not be repeated.
You describe in this book lying awake at night, not able to sleep. In this instance, you're agonizing over whether and what to publish about documents to do with National Security Agency surveillance, documents that Edward Snowden had leaked. And you write about spending the night reading about the Espionage Act of 1917 and looking at provisions that spell out prison terms. I want to know what should be keeping newsroom editors awake tonight, December 2023.
I would worry about particularly the impact of generative artificial intelligence, the idea that fake images, fake visuals of all types, whether it be photographs or videos, fake audios will be circulating rapidly. They'll be disseminated across the entire country, across the world, and it will be very difficult for the media to catch up to that. We are completely unprepared for that. People are going to believe those videos and those fake images and those fake audios, and we are not in a position as a profession to counteract that with the speed that we really need. And so that is what worries me, and I suspect that toward the end of this campaign, we'll see a lot of that stuff, and it will affect people's votes, and we in the profession won't have the capacity to deal with it.
Last thing, as you and I speak, it seems major news outlet after major news outlet has been publishing op-eds or analysis pieces, but warning about the risks and dangers of a possible second Trump presidency. My question to you, Marty Baron, is that a good idea, given a lot of people do not distinguish between reporters on the news pages and editorials and the editorial page?
Well, I think in all possible ways, we need to explain what a second Trump administration would look like. I think that is the task of people on the opinion pages. I think that's the task of reporters as well. And I think that it's an obligation.
But does it reinforce the view that Trump loves to put out there, that America media is against him, that it's a witch hunt?
Maybe it does. I don't think we have an alternative except to tell the American public what it might be in for, what it's likely to be in for if Trump were to be reelected.
Marty Baron, former editor of The Washington Post and author of Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and The Washington Post. Thank you.
Thank you.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Total Wine & More. With so many great bottles to choose from at the lowest price, it's easy to find your favorite Cabernet or a new single-barrel bourbon to try with some help from one of their friendly guides. With the lowest prices for over 30 years, find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine & More. Curbside pickup and delivery available in most areas. Visit TotalWine.com to learn more. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly. B21.
It might shock you to hear, but there are people at NPR who are absolute dorks about how things sound and, being at the right place, right time to get the right recording. I count myself in that club, and for us, Peter Breslow is one of the all-time greats. He spent years recording the world, and his book, Outtakes, Stumbling Around the World for NPR, highlights some of the good times, but also the rough times, covering real tragic stories. And he told NPR's Ayesha Rascoe about what he did to keep hope alive in those moments.
And now a peek behind the curtains of how NPR puts its stories together. Weekend Edition's former senior producer, Peter Breslow, spent nearly 40 years at the network until retiring 2 years ago. He worked both in the studio and roaming the world to bring us sounds and stories from Mount Everest to the South Pole, to a snake pit in South Florida, where he profiled a man who extracted venom for use in medical research.
I nudged the microphone to within a few inches of the vibrating diamondback. Finally, the snake's had enough, and quicker than you can blink, he strikes the padded microphone.
Peter Breslow's written a memoir about his time here. He clearly made it out of that situation. Outtakes, Stumbling Around the World for NPR, and he joins us now. Welcome back to Weekend Edition, Peter, and on the other side of the mic this time.
Yeah, it feels weird to be on this side, but great to be here.
Your book and your memoir is about some of your life before you were at NPR growing up, but also your time at NPR as a producer. What does a radio producer do?
Well, it's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. It's kind of like being a reporter, except your voice isn't on the air. It really is a lot of reporting, a lot of logistics, a lot of setting up, especially if you're going into some kind of a hazardous situation, figuring out where are we going to be when, how can we stay safe, bringing all the supplies if you're going to Sierra Leone to cover the Ebola epidemic, bringing your hygiene supplies, and if you're going to Baghdad, pack your Kevlar vest. There's such a wide range of what a producer is, right? There's show producers, which I did for many years, figuring out what's going to go on the air, what's not going to go on the air, or if news breaks while the show is on the air, how are we going to cover it? And then there's the day-to-day of interviews and figuring out the focus of the interview and then taking that 35-minute interview that you did and cutting it down to a succinct 4.5 minutes.
So you guys producers do that hard work, because I just get out here and I just talk and talk and talk.
Yeah, you really hosts have it so easy. I'm so resentful.
We're just me and Scott Simon, we're just pretty faces.
Yeah.
But you also would be on air and you write about this trek. A lot didn't go right with this Mount Everest trip.
Yeah, it was, it really was the adventure of a lifetime for me. It wasn't quite supposed to be 3 months, which is what it ended up being. I just describe it as a long, uncomfortable camping trip. We traveled across China. There were earthquakes and landslides. And once we got to the mountain, just a long, slow slog up the northeast ridge of Everest.
You have a description of when you would sleep, you said that you would wake up and see your breath from the night before, on your body. And you're also filing stories. That's incredible to me.
I guess my goal is always sort of take the listener where they aren't going to get to go on their own. And I was very privileged and lucky to get to go and actually get paid to go on an Everest expedition.
Big ice racks on either side. Places that look like they could have avalanches. Hopefully not this way. I got my beeper in my pocket. But that's definitely the last way I want to go. It's getting squished in an avalanche.
So I made it up to 23,000 feet, but it was still a schlep and a half to get to the summit, which is over 29,000 feet. And actually none of us on the expedition made it because there were high winds and we were forced to flee the mountain.
Is that your favorite story of all time?
That is very high up there. I have to also say that that very first trip I did to Afghanistan just after the U.S. invasion with Scott, that was super memorable.
And what was it about that experience that has stayed with you?
Well, it kind of encompassed everything. So we got to Bamiyan, which is, I don't know, something like 9,000 feet up. So it was kind of cold. And as soon as we got there, we found these two guys who were digging up graves. They were forced to bury some Hazara people who had been executed by the Taliban. And after the fall of the Taliban, these fellows went back and they were digging up the graves to give them a proper burial. I immediately knew that we had a fantastic open to the piece. But what happened after that, so it's getting dark and we don't have a place to stay. So we drive back into town and we find this guest house and we kind of knock on the door and the place was full. But the guy who was running it saw these well-off Americans and started to boot out all these men who were sleeping in the place. And Scott and I were kind of like, uh-oh. But also in the back of our minds, we were going, well, we don't have a place to sleep tonight. I bet they can find another place. Anyway, so like as these guys are all giving us dirty looks, a gleaming SUV pulls up. These two guys jump out, speaking very good English and saying, we're representatives of the local warlord and you're staying with us.
These stories, they're really incredible. I don't know if I won't be out there and all that to be true. I'm a little more prone to panicking. But you have covered all of these conflict zones. What do you think you have that compelled you to go into those places?
I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and I guess I always have been kind of looking to break out of that and find excitement. I do want to say that I, in no way, shape, or form, consider myself a war correspondent. The people who really are in the trenches day in and day out for months and years at a time covering conflicts. I would tend to waltz into these situations and then waltz back out.
I wanted to end with one of the stories that has really stayed with you. Is there something that comes to mind that you want to share?
So often in these more desperate situations, I try to find some kind of story of hope. And I found a really great one my last time in Afghanistan, and it was the Miraculous Love Kids Music School. This guy, Lanny Cordola, who played with the Beach Boys and a couple of other arena rock bands. He read a story about a young girl in Afghanistan whose two sisters had been killed in a suicide bomb attack. They were selling trinkets on the street, and Mursal was her name. She was 13 when I met her, was also selling trinkets, but she had gone in a different direction, and she survived. And Lanny read a story about her, and he ended up coming to Afghanistan and finding her. And one thing led to another, and he brought some instruments with him, and they started a music school. It ended up being mostly young girls, and they started playing rock music. And Lanny, because of his connections, was friendly with Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys, and they ended up collaborating on the song Love and Mercy.
Love and mercy, that's what you need tonight. So love and mercy to you and your friends tonight. I was standing in a muddy field, watching the people there.
It's a beautiful song and a beautiful story.
Even just sitting here listening to it, I get teary-eyed. It was kind of inspirational.
That's Peter Breslow, former NPR and Weekend Edition senior producer and author of the book Outtakes. Thank you so much for coming back to talk to us.
Thanks so much, Ayesha. This was fun.
You and your friends tonight.
That's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. If you want more, you can sign up for our newsletter at npr.org/newsletter/books. I'm Andrew Limbong. The podcast is produced by Isabella Gomez Sarmiento and edited by Megan Sullivan. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Fernando Nauro Roman, Melissa Gray, Ryan Bank, Todd Munt, Emiko Tamagawa, Ed McNulty, Samantha Balaban, Courtney Dorning, Erica Ryan, Matthew Sherman, and Martin Patience. Beth Donovan is our managing editor. Thanks for listening.
You can't fully understand the moment we're living in without knowing where we've been. On every episode of NPR's Throughline, we go back in time to where it started. Like, really started. To answer one important question: how did we get here? Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from South Carolina Federal Credit Union, a member-owned financial institution. South Carolina Federal is dedicated to serving your financial needs and investing in the South Carolina communities where you live and work. Visit scfederal.org.